In the year 1299, in a small patch of land in northwestern Anatolia, a tribal leader with a few hundred horsemen made a decision that would echo for 6 centuries. His name was Osman. He had no army to speak of, no capital, no fleet, just a hill, a handful of warriors, and an ambition that bordered on madness. He could not have known that the small principality he carved out that year would one day stretch from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Yemen, from the Caspian Sea to the shores of Algeria. He could not have known that his name, Osman, would become the name of an empire that ruled 3 continents, controlled the holiest cities of Islam, and decided the fate of Europe for half a millennium. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire, a story of conquest and collapse, of sultans who built golden ages and sultans who burned them down, of an empire that began with one man's gamble and ended 623 years later with a single signature on a piece of paper. To understand how the Ottomans began, you have to understand the world they were born into. By the late 1200s, the great Seljuk Empire that had once dominated the Islamic world was crumbling, shattered by Mongol invasions sweeping in from the east. In the power vacuum left behind, dozens of small Turkish principalities called beyliks fought each other for scraps of territory across Anatolia, what is now modern Turkey. Osman's beylik was one of the smallest, but it had one enormous advantage: location. His lands sat on the very edge of the Byzantine Empire, the last fading remnant of ancient Rome. While other Turkish chieftains fought each other over the interior, Osman looked west toward the wealthy, weakening, and increasingly defenseless Byzantine frontier. He fought not as a raider, but as a builder of a state. He welcomed warriors fleeing the Mongols, scholars fleeing chaos, and adventurers seeking fortune. Slowly, his band of horsemen became a movement. When Osman died around 1324, he left his son Orhan something far more valuable than land: a system, a war machine fueled by faith, opportunity, and momentum. Orhan captured the city of Bursa and made it his capital. Then his successors crossed the Dardanelles into Europe itself, the first Muslim power in history to gain a permanent foothold on European soil. By the end of the 1300s, Ottoman armies were marching through the Balkans, defeating Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms, surrounding Constantinople itself like a noose slowly tightening. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the most heavily fortified city on earth. Its triple-layered land walls had repelled Arab armies, Bulgarian khans, and crusader fleets. Everyone who tried to take it by force had failed. Everyone. In 1453, a 21-year-old sultan named Mehmed II decided he would be the one to finally break it. He brought something no army had ever brought to those walls before: massive bronze cannons forged by a Hungarian engineer, capable of firing stone balls the size of boulders. For 53 days, Ottoman cannon fire pounded the ancient walls of Constantinople, while 70,000 troops surrounded the city by land and sea. When the defenders blocked the harbor with a giant chain, Mehmed did the unthinkable. He had his ships hauled overland on greased logs in a single night to bypass the chain entirely and appear in the harbor at dawn. On May 29, 1453, the walls finally broke. Constantinople, the eternal city, the capital of Rome reborn, fell. The last Byzantine emperor died fighting in the streets. Mehmed rode his horse into the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in Christendom, and ordered it transformed into a mosque. The Byzantine Empire, which had stood for over 1,000 years since the fall of Rome itself, was erased in a single afternoon. Mehmed earned a new title that day, Fatih, the Conqueror. Constantinople would become Istanbul, the beating heart of a new empire that now stood astride 2 continents. If Mehmed gave the Ottomans their capital, it was Suleiman who gave them their golden age. He took the throne in 2020, and the Europeans who faced him on the battlefield gave him a name that has lasted ever since, Suleiman the Magnificent. To his own people, he was something else entirely, Kanuni, the lawgiver, the sultan who turned conquest into civilization. Under Suleiman, Ottoman armies captured Belgrade. They overran Hungary. In 1529, Ottoman forces stood at the gates of Vienna itself, threatening the very heart of the Habsburg Empire, sending a shockwave of fear across Christian Europe that would not fade for generations. At sea, the Ottoman navy, under the legendary Admiral Barbarossa, dominated the Mediterranean, raiding the coasts of Italy and Spain almost at will. But Suleiman's true legacy was not conquest, it was order. He rebuilt the legal code of the empire, balancing Islamic religious law with practical secular statutes governing land, taxation, and criminal justice. A system so effective it remained largely intact for centuries. Istanbul became the largest, wealthiest city in Europe, home to the legendary architect Mimar Sinan, who built mosques so vast and so elegant they remain architectural marvels 500 years later. At its peak, under Suleiman, the empire stretched across 3 continents, from Algeria in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, from Hungary in the north to Yemen in the south. It controlled the Silk Road. It controlled Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest sites in Islam. The Ottoman Sultan was now also the Caliph, the spiritual leader of the entire Sunni Muslim world. This was the empire at its absolute summit. But empires, like mountains, only have one direction left to go once they reach the peak.
Suleiman died in 1566 on campaign in his command tent, just as his armies were besieging a fortress in Hungary. His generals hid his death for weeks to prevent panic in the ranks. It was, in hindsight, a fitting metaphor. The empire's strength was already being concealed behind a curtain. By the 1800s, European diplomats had coined a cruel but accurate nickname for what had once been the terror of Christendom: the sick man of Europe. Territory bled away year after year. Greece won its independence in a brutal war in the 1820s. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria all broke free over the following decades. Egypt slipped out of direct Ottoman control. Russia pushed relentlessly southward, fighting war after war against a weakening Ottoman frontier, hungry for access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. Inside the empire, reformist sultans tried desperately to modernize. A sweeping reform movement called the Tanzimat attempted to rebuild the legal system, the military, and the economy along European lines. Railways were built. Telegraph lines connected Istanbul to the world. But reform came too slowly, fought every step of the way by entrenched conservative interests, and the empire sank deeper into debt to European banks it could never fully repay. In 1908, a group of reform-minded military officers known as the Young Turks forced the Sultan to restore constitutional government, hoping a new political system might save the dying empire. For a brief moment, there was hope, but the empire's wounds ran far deeper than any constitution could heal. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire made the fateful decision to enter the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a gamble born of desperation, an attempt to recover lost territory and lost prestige. Instead, it became the empire's death sentence. Ottoman forces fought with surprising tenacity at Gallipoli in 1915, repelling a massive Allied invasion in one of the war's bloodiest campaigns, a victory that produced a national hero who would soon become essential to this story, a young officer named Mustafa Kemal. But elsewhere, the war went catastrophically. Arab provinces rose in revolt against Ottoman rule. British forces pushed through Mesopotamia and Palestine. And within the empire's own borders, the war years brought immense human tragedy, including the mass deportation and killing of huge numbers of Armenian civilians, events widely recognized by historians today as genocide, and one of the darkest chapters of the empire's final years. By 1918, the war was lost. The empire that had once stretched across 3 continents was reduced to occupied rubble. Allied forces occupied Istanbul itself. European powers began carving up the remaining Ottoman territories like a corpse being divided among hungry wolves. What followed was not a slow decline, but a final, decisive ending. Mustafa Kemal, the same officer who had defended Gallipoli, refused to accept the partition of the Turkish homeland. He organized a nationalist resistance movement from the Anatolian interior, fighting a war of independence against occupying Greek, French, and Italian forces, all while the powerless sultan remained a virtual prisoner of foreign armies in Istanbul. Mustafa won. By 1922, his forces had pushed out the occupying armies and secured Anatolia for a new Turkish nation. And on November 1, 1922, the Grand National Assembly that Kemal led made history. It formally abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, slipped quietly out of Istanbul aboard a British warship, leaving behind the palace his ancestors had ruled from for nearly 500 years. He would never return. 623 years, 36 sultans, 3 continents, from a single hillside warband to an empire that shaped the modern borders of the Middle East, the Balkans, and North Africa. Borders whose consequences the world still navigates today. The Ottoman Empire was not simply conquered by an outside enemy. Like Rome before it, it was an empire that ultimately could not outrun the weight of its own history. Built by extraordinary ambition, sustained by extraordinary innovation, and ultimately undone by extraordinary inertia. Osman could never have imagined Vienna, or Suleiman's golden age, or the Hagia Sophia transformed into a mosque. He could never have imagined the empire's final sultan sailing quietly into exile 6 centuries later. But it all began with him, one man, on one hillside, with one impossible dream. The sultans who followed Suleiman were, with rare exceptions, simply not built of the same material. A dangerous practice had crept into the palace. Princes were no longer raised on the battlefield, training to rule. Instead, they were locked away in a gilded section of the palace called the cage, isolated from real power, real warfare, real governance, sometimes for decades, until the day they were suddenly handed an empire to run. Some sultans who emerged from the cage were brilliant, many were not. Power increasingly slipped into the hands of grand viziers, palace eunuchs, and, in a period historians still call the Sultanate of Women, influential queen mothers who effectively ran the empire behind the curtain of the harem. Meanwhile, the world outside Ottoman borders was changing in ways the empire failed to fully grasp. European powers were discovering ocean routes to Asia, bypassing the overland trade routes the Ottomans had controlled for centuries. Spanish and Portuguese ships were bringing back gold and silver from the Americas, destabilizing Ottoman currency. Europe was entering a scientific and industrial transformation. The empire that had once been the most innovative military power on earth began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to fall behind. In 1683, Ottoman forces made one final desperate attempt to take Vienna. They failed. The retreat that followed marked something historians consider a turning point. For the first time in centuries, the Ottomans were no longer the side dictating the terms of war in Europe. They were now playing defense.